Tonight, I want us to explore the question of how Christians should date. And this is an extremely important question because this is how our culture has determined how we should pursue a spouse. And in fact, I think nearly everyone in the United States who is married first had a date with their spouse. And since marriage is such an important question, it's only natural that we should explore how we should date in a Christian fashion. This is a very difficult question to consider when we consider the Scriptures, because when we look at the biblical narrative from beginning to end, we don't find a single example of dating. Dating is a relatively new invention. When we look at the first marriage in Genesis chapter 2, verse 22, we find that God brought Eve to Adam. How convenient is that? And then when we continue the biblical narrative, we see that marriage, in many ways, is a very corporate decision where families come together and they decide who should be married and who shouldn't. Now, that's not to say that the people getting married didn't have a say. We certainly find that in examples like 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 20, where Saul organizes his marriage between Michal and David. And we also find when we look at Genesis chapter 24, and we see where Abraham sends his servant to go find a wife for Isaac. Her family had time to consider it, and they even consulted her as well. But when we consider how we should date today, even though we don't find maybe an example of people dating in the Scriptures, we do find many principles that we can apply. However, unfortunately, with dating the way it is structured today, it provides many, unfortunately, unnecessary obstacles. And so before we actually talking about how we should date, I want us to briefly consider the history of dating. And I want us to just briefly consider this excerpt from this article I found. It's kind of lengthy, but I think it can explain how dating became what it is today. The concept of dating really began at the turn of the 20th century. Prior to the early 1900s, courtship was a more private, unemotional affair. Women would meet several men with her parents present to whittle down the pickings to the most suitable match for marriage, which heavily relied on factors like financial and social status. The first decade of the 20th century was marked by the figure of the gentleman caller. If a young man was interested in a young woman, he would follow the proper protocol of going to her house and calling upon her. And if he was invited in, he would be brought into the parlor. I don't know if we have parlors in our houses today, but this little room to the side, he would go in and wait. And if things went well, he would be invited back at specific times. And then eventually, if things went well, they would get married. However, this began to change in the early 20th century when couples began to go out in public together unsupervised. Still, the ultimate goal at this time was for them to find someone to get married. But with the introduction of dating also came the focus on falling in love rather than finding a society-approved match. In previous years, love was not seen as being a central importance to marriage. If people fell in love, they often fell in love after they got married. But with the introduction of dating, there came an increased desire for romance and love before deciding to get married. And between the popularization of rock and roll and the protest of the Vietnam War in the 1960s, we find that youths were not only desiring to resist the government and certain policies, but there was this desire to shirk off old social conventions. And with the 50s, we saw that young people started to experiment with sex. And by the 60s, the resulting explosion of sexual activity was essentially in the name of freedom to protest all these different things. And this became a normal facet of dating culture. And with dating how it is today, there are many people who date simply just for fun. Some people date to get married, but some people will date and marriage may not even come up. In fact, people might date for several years at a time, and marriage might not even come up till 3 or 4 years down the road. And so we have come to an interesting spot in our culture where the way in which you get married is you start out by dating, but the way that dating is structured, the way that many people think of dating, is something that may or may not involve marriage. And so while we as Christians, if we are single and we are desiring a marriage, we will date, but we have to make sure that we are strategic about it, that we do things in a way that are very different than how the culture has laid out. And hopefully with this brief summarization of the history of dating, it'll allow us to understand why certain obstacles have been created, which we'll talk about later, as well as how to overcome them. But let's first ask the question, what is the goal of dating? At least for the Christian. Well, the goal for us is to find a spouse. I know that might sound obvious, but again, remember, not everyone feels this way. But our goal is not just to find a spouse, but a godly spouse. We find in Proverbs chapter 19, verse 14, that Solomon says, "House and wealth are inherited from fathers, but a prudent wife is from the Lord." A good and godly spouse is considered a gift from God. And what we find throughout the biblical narrative, sometimes stated in more subtle ways, sometimes in more explicit ways, is that when you marry the right person, life is better in every single way. But when you marry the wrong person, especially someone who does not share our values, there are always consequences. And let's consider one. Let's turn to 1 Kings chapter 11. 1 Kings chapter 11, let's read verses 1 through 4 together. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people, "You shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn your heart after other gods." Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives, who were princesses, and 300 concubines. And the wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. So we see that Solomon married women who did not share his values, and therefore his heart was turned away from God. Now you might say, well, maybe he just had too many wives. And certainly according to Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17, he certainly had too many wives. That was an issue. But what is emphasized here is that specifically these wives did not share his values. And because of that, that transmuted his values into something that was antithetical to the will of God. So we have to remember that as Christians who are dating or seeking a spouse, we must remember that we are seeking a spouse that shares our values. But as we are in this process, not only should we be seeking a spouse, we should already be seeking to become the spouse that not only God needs us to be, but that our future spouse needs us to be. Many people often ask the question of, how do I find the person that is right for me? That's a very important question. But many people, unfortunately, are under the assumption that if they simply find someone who is compatible, it will all work out. Many people are under that assumption. If I just find the right person, things will just work out naturally. And even if you do find someone who is very compatible, someone who is a proper counter to your personality and temperament, you cannot take two people who are different, with different personalities, different background, different experiences, and just expect things to work out naturally. What we find in the scriptures, especially when we consider Ephesians chapter 5, is that marriage takes more than simply people who are compatible, but people who are willing to demonstrate Christ-like and sacrificial love toward one another. What we find in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21, is that Paul begins, as he's about to address Christian marriages, he says that you are to be subject or to be submissive to one another. For a marriage to be successful, both couples must be willing to put their spouse above themselves. And as he goes on to elaborate, they are to emulate the love that Christ has with his church. He says in Ephesians 5:24, "But as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything." He goes on in verse 25 to state that husbands are to love their wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. So we see this mutual love, this mutual sacrificial love that they are to demonstrate to one another. Now, of course, we as Christians, we as people who are seeking to conform more and more to the image of Christ, certainly we ought to be people who love and love in a sacrificial way. But when we get married, we are required to do this, not just when we have occasion in our life to the people we interact with, but to one person in particular every single day. Our entire life becomes centered around them, of course, second to God. And with this, there is a greater deal of sacrifice and maturity that is required. A sacrificial love that you've likely never had to demonstrate before in your life. And as we are in the process of dating or seeking a spouse, this should be the mentality that we are seeking to cultivate. So by the time we are married, we are the person that they need us to be. And not only that, we often attract the people in our life, we often attract people like us. And so if we are intending to attract a godly spouse, a mature spouse, we need to be willing and able to demonstrate those same virtues and characteristics. Now let's talk about the process of dating. Where do we as Christians find a date? Well, probably the best place to find a date is at church. That's not why you go to church, but while you're there, if you are seeking someone who is godly, part of the reason we go to church is to honor God. The main reason we go to church is to honor God, and the people who make God the center of their lives, who center their schedules around Him, are going to show up here. And so if you're seeking someone godly who is virtuous, this is the best place to be. Although, it just really depends on the makeup of the congregation. There might be a situation where you're the only single person, everyone else is taken. Or you might be single, but everyone else is, maybe out of your age range. And so thankfully, there's normally congregations in the area that you can visit and go establish relationships with, and that might give you an opportunity to find the right person. Also, thankfully, with the evolution of technology and various dating apps, we are not limited to people within 3 or 4 miles from us. We can interact with people all over the United States, and thankfully, there are more Christian-centered apps where you can find someone who is also seeking the truth or seeking God. Now, we do have a website called Church of Christ Singles, and I've heard really good things about the website. I've known various people who've met their significant other on that website. I've also heard it's kind of dated and buggy, so just keep that in mind. But where should Christians date? Thankfully, there are a lot of options to choose from. And it really depends on the individual. There's the classic dinner and a movie. There's various kinds of activities such as disc golf, putt-putt, bowling. Axe throwing has become very popular. So if you want something a little bit more intense, there's that. One of the things that I often found was helpful for me before I met my wonderful wife is just inviting someone to coffee. And one of the great things about coffee is that it doesn't have the same romantic connotations as dinner. When you ask someone out to dinner, well, there are certain romantic expectations. But coffee is just coffee. A lot of people drink coffee. If you don't like coffee, there's ice cream. But, there aren't as many expectations, and that can just be a time where you get to know someone. Now, in our question and answer box, someone specifically asked, how do you ask someone out on a date? And that might sound like a question with an obvious answer, but it's a little bit more difficult than that because this typically falls on the man to be the one asking. And as you can imagine, this is not something they teach you in school. You never go to a class that gives you the one-on-one on how to go about this. And the answer is simple. You ask. And it's difficult because you have to be vulnerable. You have to put yourself out there. And it's easier said than done. But one of the things, any Christian would need to do is to maintain some level of confidence for 15 to 30 seconds. And if you are fearful, just hide that anxiety for 15 to 30 seconds so you can have your panic attack later and just see how it goes. And the worst thing that can happen is they can say no. But even if that's the case, you can focus your energy elsewhere. Now, this doesn't necessarily just have to fall to men, even though it typically does. What often, women in general do is they typically send signals out. and in one particular direction, and they assume that it's clear enough for the guy to pick up on so that they can ask them out on a date. Sometimes they're clear, sometimes they're not. Sometimes men just don't notice the signals. Sometimes the signals aren't very clear. And there have been various situations where men have received mixed signals, and so they've given up on trying to decode them. When me and my wife first met, apparently, she sent me a lot of signals that I did not realize until 3 years later. And, I asked her, I said, well, what were these signals? She's like, I was so nice and polite to you. I was like, I thought you were just a nice and polite person. And she was, and she is. But what I would just recommend is let's not beat around the bush. If you think there is someone who might make a good spouse, just ask. Let's avoid the signals if we can. Life is too short for these kinds of things. But with that out of the way, let's consider some obstacles that are created due to our modern context of dating. Because dating has evolved from this practice in the 1920s where people go out to see if they're a suitable match for marriage. It has evolved into something that for many people, they just see it as something for fun. And because of this, different maybe objective to dating, talking about difficult or serious or things concerning the future are sometimes seen as off-putting or inappropriate or something that is seen as rushing things. For example, even for secular people, I have this one friend, really great guy. He's in his 30s. He's more on the secular and agnostic side, and he wanted to settle down. He wanted to find a spouse. And he felt that as he was dating, if he brought up something like marriage or expectations about marriage or kids, that it was just very off-putting. And even if he brought it up in a very appropriate and logical way. If we as Christians are seeking someone to marry, if we have asked someone out because we think they are a good candidate for marriage, if someone has accepted our invitation because they think we're a good candidate for marriage, these are not topics that we should avoid. Now, of course, there is a right way and an appropriate way, and even a subtle way to bring them up. But if we're investing our time and energy into a particular person, it's important to know what their expectations are on the front end. If you are planning to have 8 kids and they're planning to only have 2, maybe you should know that ahead of time. If they are planning to get married 10 years from now and you're planning to get married in a year, well, maybe that should be something you talk about ahead of time. Now, of course, there are, bad ways to go about it. It's one thing to say, hey, what do you want to accomplish before you get married versus, well, when we get married, I've already picked out the names of our 5 kids. That's a little bit more forward and awkward, obviously. But we should be cultivating a culture in our own dating circles where, serious topics like this are discussed and are not seen as awkward or inappropriate. Another unfortunate obstacle that has been created with our modern dating culture is this prioritization of our own feelings and emotions. As we talked about earlier, over the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, people began to prioritize this idea of finding love before you got married. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a good thing. But what people often confuse for love is this intense infatuation. Now, as we saw in Ephesians chapter 5, the kind of love we are to manifest is this sacrificial love where we put someone else's needs and desires above our own. That's what love is from a biblical perspective. But what many people get lost in or distracted by is this sense of infatuation. What we find, in a lot of media over the past 100 years is this very abstract concept of true love. Who here has seen The Princess Bride? Okay, you guys are going to get this one. Okay, sounds good. The thesis of the entire movie is that the best thing in the world is true love. And it's so powerful that it can even bring back someone who's mostly dead back to life. But true love is never really defined. It's just this abstract thing that we can maybe find or experience. But what most people think of as true love, this intense infatuation, is actually a little bit closer to drug use than something you can actually build a marriage off of. Let me read you this quote that I found concerning this feeling of infatuation. Researchers have scanned the brains of people who are madly in love and found a surge of heavy dopamine, a neurotransmitter in the brain's reward system that helps people feel pleasure. Dopamine, along with other chemicals, gives us that energy, focus, and obsession that we feel. Falling in love is an obsession. While you're wild about someone, your serotonin levels go down, which is the same trend we typically find in people with obsessive-compulsive behavior. Further brain imaging studies have shown that the activity in the nucleus accumbens, a region of the brain that lights up when someone is addicted to a substance like cocaine or a behavior like gambling. Now, by the way, I'm not saying this infatuation is a bad thing. It certainly can be a useful tool. I'm not saying it's wrong to be attracted to someone. But when people feel feelings like this, it can cause them to miss serious red flags. We've all known that person in our lives who's dating someone who's clearly wrong for them, and everyone and their mother sees the issues. But they're the only ones that can't see the red flags because instead of following some virtue or principle or comparing the life of the person they're dating with the Scripture, they're following this feeling. What are we reminded in Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9? Jeremiah says that, hold on one second. We all know it. I know it. Gary, what is it? The heart is deceitful above all things. Thank you, Gary. I just wrote the verse because I know it, but I didn't write it out. Thank you. The heart is deceitful above all. That's right. And even when we're dating, when we're engaging with people, and when we feel this feeling, it's not a bad feeling, but it should not be the main thing that leads us in picking a spouse. And, if you are at a position in your life where you are single, where you're unattached, where you don't even have a crush on anyone, and now is actually the best time in your life to study marriage in the Scriptures, to consider and meditate on what a godly spouse is, the kind of godly spouse you need to be, and the kind of person you ought to look for. Because, when we do fall in love, when we do feel this infatuation, it's so easy for us to justify and make all these kinds of irrational excuses about why we should be with them. But if you're at a place in your life where you can sit back and meditate without these distracted feelings, this is the best thing you can do so that when you do find someone you do have these feelings for, you can sit back and consider what you've studied and to see if this person is really the person you need to be with. Another obstacle of modern dating that has been created is that it has become more difficult to maintain purity toward each other. For a long time, the way that courtship in general functioned was it created a context where two people get to know each other, but it didn't really provide a context where they could commit sexual immorality. But the way that dating is structured today, it creates a context with a lot of alone time and a lot of isolation. And of course, we as Christians, we know and appreciate the value of human sexuality, and we understand that it is something good and beautiful in its own time. But to violate this goes against the will of God. As Paul reminds us in 1 Thessalonians 4:3, he says, "For this is the will of God for your sanctification," or for your holiness, "that you abstain from sexual immorality." And in verse 7 he says, "For God has not called us for impurity, but in holiness." And we're again reminded in Hebrews 13, verse 4, "Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous." And what we find, from the very beginning, all the way back to Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, is this idea that God has designed this for married couples to build the bond so that they can become one flesh. And studies have shown that couples that wait until they're married are more likely to have a satisfying marriage and less likely to get a divorce. However, when we use this only to gratify ourselves, not only are we misusing what God has designed, we are cheating ourselves and the person whom we love. And therefore, in light of how dating is normally performed today, we as Christians should be more strategic and more wise in how we go about it. We have to cultivate practices and lifestyles that help us maintain this sense of purity toward each other. Now, that's not to say that we cannot be alone with the person we're dating, but it does mean we're more thoughtful about it. For example, if we have a significant other that we want to come over for dinner or for a movie, maybe we set particular limits. Maybe we say, hey, we hang out till 9, then you go home, then we talk on the phone to 12 o'clock or whatever you normally do. And part of the reason that is because we know that, if you love someone and you are attracted to them, and as the night goes on, well, your inhibitions lower because you get tired, and you're more likely to create a context where you make a mistake. And as Jesus reminds us in Mark chapter 14, verse 38, that the spirit is indeed willing, but it's our flesh that is weak. And this is something that we have to keep in mind as we are dating because, unfortunately, when it comes to these kinds of things, intimacy is just a normal part of dating culture today. But hopefully, if we're dating someone who is godly, who shares our values, they're going to be on the same page, and their goal is to want to maintain this level of purity for your relationship and for your relationship with God. And as Jesus reminds us in Luke chapter 17, verses 1 through 2, he said to his disciples, "Temptations to sin are sure to come, but woe to the one through whom they come." And certainly, not only do we want to avoid creating a context where we might be tempted, but if this is the person we love and we care about, certainly we do not want to become the stumbling block in their life. So as we conclude, let's summarize some of the things we've thought about. We acknowledge that dating the way that it is today has unfortunately created a lot of obstacles for us. It has made dating itself more shallow, more difficult to have serious conversations. It sometimes creates a context where we are too persuaded by our emotions, and it also can create many different temptations. Therefore, we as Christians have to do things differently. We have to do things more thoughtfully, more strategically, and we want to make sure that we are maintaining this level of holiness that God desires for each of us. And again, if you are at a place where you are single, but you're seeking, and you're unattached, this is the best time in your life to meditate on marriage, to meditate on what God wants for you, and to already have a plan for how you need to pursue dating and pursue finding a spouse. And of course, this is a perfect time to devote ourselves to prayer. Prayer not only for God to send us a spouse, but also for God to make us into the kind of spouse that He needs us to be and that they need us to be as well. But before we conclude tonight, if there's anyone here who has any spiritual need, if there's something in your life that you're dealing with, if there's maybe a problem at work or in your life that we can pray about, we know that God will hear our petition and He will give you the strength and the wisdom to overcome that particular situation. Or if there's any particular temptation in your life that you have a concern about, we'd love to go to God on your behalf. And if you're here today and you're not a Christian, but you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, you're willing to repent of your sins and put Christ on in baptism, we can help you with that right now. If there's anything we can do for you spiritually, please come forward as we stand and sing.